It is not yet 5 in the morning, and I have already carried 2 full buckets of water up a slope steep enough that I have to stop halfway and set them down just to catch my breath. There is no faucet in this part of the garden. There has never been one. My knees complain about this walk more than they did 20 years ago, and I make it anyway, because the vegetables do not know or care how old my knees have gotten. The handles of these buckets have worn a particular groove into my palms over the decades. One I notice most clearly on the mornings my hands ache before I've even picked them up. I switch which hand carries which bucket about halfway up, an old habit, so neither shoulder bears the whole weight of the climb alone. Nobody taught me this trick directly. I simply arrived at it myself, sometime in my 30s, through the plain, repeated logic of a body looking for whatever relief it could find on a hill that was never going to get any less steep. I want to be honest with you from the very first sentence of this video, because I think too many people romanticize a life like mine before they've actually had to live inside it. This is not a peaceful, simple existence, gently unfolding in soft morning light while a wise old woman tends her garden with a contented smile. Some mornings it is exactly that. Most mornings it is closer to what I just described: sore knees, heavy buckets, a slope that doesn't care how tired I am, and a husband inside who will need help out of bed within the hour. I live a genuinely hard life, by most standards the modern world would recognize, in a place far enough from anything resembling a city that convenience, as most of you understand the word, simply does not exist here. And I want to tell you today, as honestly as I know how, what that hardship has actually done to me and for me across 93 years, because I don't think the answer is nearly as simple as either it's terrible or it's secretly wonderful. And I think you deserve the messier, truer version rather than whichever one makes for a tidier story. My name is Sachiko Yuhara. I am 93 years old, and I live in the hills of northern Okinawa, near a village called Ogimi, in a house my husband and I built with our own hands in 1958. The nearest full hospital is roughly 40 minutes away by car, longer by the kind of transportation many of my older neighbors actually have available to them. The nearest large supermarket is further still. On a bad weather day, when the roads flood the way they sometimes do during typhoon season, both might as well be twice that distance. I have lived in exactly 2 houses in my entire life, the one I was born in, a short walk from here, and this one. I have never lived in an apartment, never lived somewhere with a doorman or a delivery service or a corner store open past dark. I say this not as a boast and not as a complaint either, but simply so you understand the full shape of what far from civilization has actually meant for me across an entire lifetime, rather than as a phrase borrowed for a single dramatic video. This has simply been the whole of my life, ordinary to me in exactly the way your own daily conveniences are ordinary to you, until someone from somewhere else points out how unusual it looks from the outside. I want to walk you through what an ordinary day actually costs here, physically, because I think far from civilization sounds romantic from a distance and feels considerably more like arithmetic up close. The water I carry each morning is one small piece of a larger pattern that defines nearly everything about how a day unfolds in this house. We do have running water in the kitchen itself. I should say plainly, I don't want to overstate our remoteness into something it isn't, but the garden, the outer washing area, and the small shed where I keep tools are all separate from that single indoor tap, built decades before anyone thought to run pipe to every corner of a property the way newer homes might. So water gets carried by hand in buckets, the distance between where it comes out of the ground and wherever it's actually needed that day. I have done this so many thousands of times that I could tell you, without thinking, exactly how much a full bucket pulls at my shoulder on the uphill half of that walk, and exactly how much less it pulls once the slope evens out. Firewood is similar. We do have a gas burner now, installed sometime in my 60s, which I'll admit was a genuine relief. But certain dishes, and certainly the outdoor bath Kenji still insists on some evenings, still call for a wood fire, which means wood needs cutting, splitting, carrying, and stacking on a schedule that doesn't pause for how either of us is feeling that week. I split kindling myself well into my 80s before my grip finally convinced me it was Kenji's grandson's job now, not mine, a handoff that took considerably more negotiation than the actual physical task ever had. I remember the specific afternoon I finally agreed to give up the axe because I think it says something honest about how this life actually feels from the inside, rather than how it looks described from a distance. I was 84. My grip had been failing me for perhaps a year by then. Small signs I'd mostly ignored, a dropped cup here, a jar I could no longer twist open there, until the day I swung the axe and simply couldn't finish the motion with any real control. I sat down on the woodpile afterward and cried, not from the failed swing itself, but from what it meant, plainly, about a threshold I had just crossed and couldn't cross back over. Kenji's grandson took the axe from me gently the following week, and I let him, and I have not split wood since. I tell you this because I think the honest experience of aging inside a physically demanding life is not one long, graceful continuation. It is punctuated by specific, remembered afternoons like that one, each marking some capacity quietly gone for good. There is no elevator anywhere in this house, obviously, and no elevator anywhere in this village. For that matter, nothing here was ever built tall enough to need one. Every errand involves stairs, slopes, or both, usually on foot, since the nearest bus stop is itself a 15-minute walk from our front door. And the bus that eventually arrives runs only a handful of times a day. I mention all of this not to complain exactly, though I want to be honest that I do complain about it out loud more often than the peaceful image of an elderly Okinawan grandmother probably allows for. I mention it because I think there's a real question worth asking honestly. What does a life built entirely around this kind of unavoidable physical effort actually do to a body, decade after decade, compared to a life where nearly all of it has been engineered away? I think about this most clearly when Kenji's grandson visits from Naha, where he's lived for some years now in an apartment with an elevator and a car parked directly outside it. He is 30 years old, considerably stronger than either of us in any measurable sense. And yet I've watched him arrive here slightly winded by the same walk up from the bus stop that I make most mornings without particular difficulty, simply because his own ordinary days never ask his legs to do what mine ask of me constantly. I don't say this to make him sound weak. He isn't by any fair measure. I say it because I think it illustrates something plainly. A body responds to what it is regularly asked to do at any age, and mine has simply been asked to do considerably more than his has for considerably longer, whether either of us ever chose that arrangement deliberately. Researchers who study aging have a specific interest in exactly this question, and I want to share what I've learned from them because I think it reframes the hardship without erasing it. The physical demands I've just described carrying, climbing, walking distances most modern infrastructure was specifically designed to eliminate happen to be almost precisely the pattern researchers recommend when they talk about preserving strength and mobility into old age. Frequent, moderate, unavoidable load-bearing movement spread across an entire day, rather than concentrated into a single workout followed by many hours of sitting still. I did not choose this pattern for its research backing. Nobody explained cardiovascular health or grip strength to me when I was carrying my first bucket of water at 7 years old. I simply lived somewhere that offered no alternative for most of the 20th century to doing things the hard way. I want to be honest about the other side of this, though, because I don't think it would be fair to describe only the parts of this hardship that turned out to be secretly good for me. The real, unglamorous danger of living this far from things is not abstract, and researchers studying rural healthcare in Japan have documented it plainly. A recent review of healthcare access across Japan's rural and remote regions found persistent shortages of healthcare providers, limited transportation infrastructure, and older adults who had lost the ability to drive facing genuinely restricted access to essential services, including home-based and long-term care, on islands even more remote than this part of Okinawa. Researchers studying medical care patterns found that residents often had lower rates of referral to specialists, island, not because they needed specialist care less, but because getting there was simply harder, a gap in access rather than a gap in need. I don't want to describe my own situation as equivalent to the most isolated island communities researchers have studied. We are considerably better connected than that, but the underlying pattern, distance quietly limiting care in ways that aren't always obvious until an emergency reveals them, is real here too. And I don't think it's honest to leave it out of a video about the hardship of this life. I think about this specifically every time Kenji has a bad night now. If something serious happened to him at 2 a.m, the ambulance would need real time to reach us, more time than it would need in a city. And I have thought, more than once about what those extra minutes might mean on the worst possible night. This is not a comfortable thing to say aloud, and I've noticed that most descriptions of a simple, traditional life leave this part out entirely in favor of the softer, more marketable image. I don't want to leave it out. It's real, and I think anyone considering a life like mine, or even just admiring it from a distance, deserves to know it's part of the honest cost. A researcher who visited this district a few years ago, studying exactly this problem, told me something I've never forgotten. She said that in a city, distance from care is measured in minutes. Out here, she said, it's measured in whether the weather cooperates, whether the one road stays open, whether a neighbor happens to be home with a working car at the moment you need one. I did not enjoy hearing that stated so plainly, but I have not been able to argue with it since, and I think you deserve to hear it stated just as plainly as she said it to me. She also told me something else that stayed with me longer than I expected it to. She said that the households she'd studied who fared best in genuine emergencies were rarely the ones with the most resources on paper, but the ones who had already, well before any crisis, mapped out exactly who would help and how, rather than trusting it would simply sort itself out when the moment came. I think about that conversation every time I hear someone describe a remote, traditional life as though its safety were guaranteed by tradition alone. It isn't. It's guaranteed, when it's guaranteed at all, by the same deliberate planning any sensible household anywhere would need, simply applied to a harder set of circumstances than most people ever have to plan around. Growing much of our own food is the piece of this life I find easiest to describe warmly, though I want to be careful not to make it sound effortless either. Between the sweet potato, the vegetables, and what Kenji still occasionally brings back from fishing when his knees allow it, a real portion of what we eat never travels through any store at all. This matters for reasons beyond nutrition, though I've talked with you before about the food itself in other videos. It matters because when the road floods during typhoon season, or when a supply truck simply doesn't come for a few days, we are considerably less affected than a household entirely dependent on a supermarket 40 minutes away. I don't think of this as some deliberate strategy on our part. I think of it as the accidental result of never having had a reliable enough supply chain to depend on in the first place, which forced a kind of resilience that a more convenient life would have had no reason to develop. I want to be honest that this resilience has real limits too, and I don't want to overstate it. A bad typhoon season, a poor harvest year, an illness that keeps me out of the garden for weeks at a time, any of these can genuinely strain what we're able to grow and gather. And there have been years in my life, particularly in the difficult decades after the war, when what the garden provided was not nearly enough and hunger was a real, close thing rather than a distant memory. My own mother rationed rice by the spoonful during those years, counting it out with a precision I still remember watching as a child, though I didn't understand until much later exactly what that careful counting meant about how little we actually had. I don't want you to hear we grow our own food as some guarantee of security. I want you to hear it as one layer of protection among several, useful precisely because it's one layer rather than the only one, alongside the community and the formal support systems I've described in other conversations we've had. The typhoons themselves deserve their own honest mention because they are not a minor inconvenience here, the way a strong storm might be described elsewhere. This house, like most traditional homes on this island, was built with low, sturdy roof lines and thick coral stone walls specifically because the people who built homes here for generations understood, long before any engineer explained the physics to them, that a house on this island needs to survive. Winds capable of tearing apart anything built the way houses are built in gentler climates. I have weathered more typhoons than I could accurately count, including several in my lifetime severe enough to genuinely frighten me, hunched with Kenji in the most interior room of this house, listening to sounds I still don't fully have words for. This is not a peaceful backdrop to a peaceful life. It is a real, recurring danger that shapes how every structure here gets built, how every garden gets planned, how every emergency kit gets stocked, year after year by people who have no choice but to take it seriously. I remember one storm in particular when I was perhaps 60 that took the roof off a neighbor's newer, more modern house entirely, while our own older, lower structure held. I don't tell you this to suggest older is always better or to romanticize what was simply a difference in construction technique. I tell you because I think it illustrates something honest about hardship and tradition both. The old ways here were not preserved out of sentiment. They were preserved because people who ignored them more than once in living memory lost their roofs, and sometimes worse, and the ones who survived learned, quite directly, which habits were worth keeping and which were not. I want to be honest with you now about something that I think matters more than any single fact I've shared so far. I do not want you to romanticize this life, and I would be doing you a disservice if I let you leave this video thinking I secretly believe hardship itself is the answer to a long life. Hardship without support is simply hardship. I have watched elderly neighbors further along this same road, living genuinely isolated versions of what I've described today, the same physical demands, the same distance from care but without the moai, without a spouse or nearby family, without the community checking in the way mine reliably does. Their hardship did not make them stronger. It wore them down faster and more completely than an easier life would have. And I think it would be dishonest of me to suggest otherwise simply because it complicates a tidier story about resilience. The physical demands of this life appear to help specifically when they're paired with real support underneath them. Enough food security, enough community, enough access to care when something goes seriously wrong. Remove that support, and the same hardship stops building strength and starts simply causing harm. I think of one neighbor specifically, a widower who lived alone about 1 kilometer from here for the last several years of his life, without the kind of moai I've relied on my whole life. His children having settled far away and rarely visiting. He carried the same water, split the same wood, climbed the same hills I climb every day. None of it seemed to build him up the way it's built me. He simply grew thinner and more withdrawn each year, and when he finally fell, badly, nobody found him for the better part of a day. I don't tell you this story to frighten you needlessly. I tell you because I think his hardship and mine looked nearly identical from the outside, and turned out underneath to be almost entirely different experiences, depending entirely on what surrounded them. I've wondered why the version of this life that reaches people far from here tends to arrive so. Thoroughly softened the garden, the sunshine, the wisdom with the water buckets and the flooded roads, and the ambulance response time quietly left out of the frame. I don't think anyone is deliberately deceiving you. I think a genuinely difficult, physically demanding life described with total honesty simply doesn't photograph as beautifully and doesn't travel as easily as a softened version with the hardest parts trimmed away. I understand the appeal of the softened version. I have simply decided, sitting here telling you this myself, that I trust you with the real one instead. If there is something practical for you in all of this, I don't think the answer is moving somewhere remote or giving up your own conveniences out of some belief that difficulty alone is virtuous. I think the answer is smaller and more specific than that. Look honestly at where modern convenience has quietly removed physical effort from your own ordinary day, and consider deliberately putting a small piece of it back, not because struggle is good for its own sake, but because your body was built for exactly the kind of frequent, moderate load I've described today, whether or not your life currently asks that of you. Park further away than you need to. Carry the groceries in 2 trips instead of 1 on purpose, rather than always taking the cart to the door. Take the stairs on the days your knees allow it. None of this requires hardship in any meaningful sense. It requires noticing where ease has been added so thoroughly that your body no longer has any reason to work at all, and choosing in small, safe ways to hand a little of that work back to yourself. And if you or someone you love lives somewhere genuinely remote, the way I do, I'd encourage you to be honest about the real risk that distance creates, rather than trusting resilience alone to carry you through an emergency. Know exactly how long help would actually take to reach you, and don't guess at that number. Call and ask, the way I finally did myself a few years ago. Rather than assuming, build the kind of community around yourself that notices quickly when something's wrong, the way I've described in other conversations we've had. Keep real supplies on hand for the days the road floods or the truck doesn't come in enough water, enough food that doesn't spoil, enough of whatever medication matters most, to outlast a delay considerably longer than you'd expect. Hardship on its own proved nothing for my neighbor down the road. It was only ever the support underneath it that made the difference between his last years and mine. And that part, unlike the water buckets and the slope up to my garden, is something you can build deliberately wherever you happen to live. I mentioned my moai in other conversations we've had, the friends who show up so reliably that missing them means something. If you'd like to be one of the people who's simply here again next time, there's a small button near this video that does exactly that, and I'd genuinely be glad to have you stay. Tell me, if you'd like, what hard actually looks like in your own life, and whether it's the kind of hard that builds something or the kind that simply wears a person down. I read what people share, and I suspect the honest answer for most of you is more complicated than either extreme, the way it has always been more complicated than either extreme for me. On the mornings I resent this life every bit as much as the mornings I'm grateful for it, sometimes within the very same hour. Next time, I'd like to tell you about the typhoons themselves in more detail than I gave them today, what we actually do to prepare, house by house, in the days before one arrives, and what I've learned the hard way about which preparations turned out to matter and which ones never did. Thank you for sitting with me this morning. It was, like most mornings here, a genuinely hard one. Water buckets and all, and I find even after telling you all of this so plainly, that I wouldn't trade it for an easier one nearly as often as you might expect.